Welcome to today's webinar. Good morning if you're in the Americas. Good evening if you're in Europe. And I hope that we have our colleagues from Asia as well, although it's going to be quite late at night. Now, we're really delighted that so many have joined today because this is quite a special occasion. Many of you will be aware that we ran the first ever global DEI census in June and July this year. And then since the summer, we have been digging into the findings. Now, tomorrow is UN Human Rights Day. And so we thought that that was a good time to release more in-depth findings, having gone with a fine tooth comb through some of the data, and to try and highlight themes and topics and findings that business leaders can use to help drive positive change on diversity, equity, and inclusion across the marketing industry. Today, we've got the findings from that report, and that report, as you can see there, is downloadable on the website. And so please do go ahead and download a copy for yourself now. And we'll be giving you a brief overview of the findings from that report, but we'll also have a terrific panel of experts who are going to be discussing those report findings in more detail. Just very quickly, I just want to say a word of thanks again to all the industry organizations who partnered with the WFA and helped us pull together the responses for the survey at the very beginning. It really was a first ever global DEI census and required an unprecedented industry collaboration to get that. And it's not every day that you see all these logos next to each other, not just at a global level, but 160 organizations partnered with us around the world. And a very special mention as well to our colleagues in the UK, because they ran a similar survey at a local level in March, just preceding our census. And in many terms, they created a kind of blueprint for our global approach. And Phil at ISBA, the UK Advertiser Association, and Sharon, who's joining us shortly, the Advertising Association, were extremely generous with their time and in terms of the learnings. A quick disclaimer, however, because despite calling it a DEI census, there is, of course, no such thing as an optional census. When we embarked on this project, we quickly understood why it had never been run before, because checking the legal requirements and cultural sensitivities of asking for such sensitive data in 27 very different jurisdictions and markets, from Japan to India to Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Sweden, Brazil, and so on, is a big ask. And so it was a monumental task. But now we feel like we have the ingredients for a replicable recipe, which we're going to be rerunning in 2023. So we've got the 10,000 responses, in-depth understanding of the lived experiences of 10,000 individuals around the world. And we think that that's a tremendous baseline on which to measure progress, bearing in mind that we'll be rerunning this research in 2023. And we very much welcome and hope that others will join us on that journey if they weren't able to on the previous run. Now I'm going to show you a very quick video, which we've just finalized now, which gives you some top line learnings, and then I'm going to hand over to some colleagues who are going to talk you through some of the findings in more details. But let's run the findings video, please. So there's a teaser of the top line findings, and we do encourage all of you to share that more broadly. They're going to be discussed by our amazing panel in just a minute. We're delighted to be welcomed by Belinda Smith, who's WFA Diversity Ambassador and also CEO for the Americas of M6. Emily Graham, who's Chief Equity and Impact Officer at Omnicom. Sharon Lloyd Barnes, who I mentioned earlier, who's the diversity lead at the Advertising Association. Putri Realita, who's head of inclusion and diversity at Danone, are going to go through the findings and give their views. But first of all, let me introduce Gareth, who's been a star and a massive supporter on this project. Gareth, who's head of CX Partnership Services and Insights at Kantar, has been very much on top of the data from start to finish, and he's going to give a little bit more in-depth insight into the findings. Over to you, Gareth.
Thank you, Will, and hello, everybody. It's great to get the opportunity to speak to you all today, and it's so exciting to be finally debriefing on what has been a labour of love for many of us this year. I'm also really looking forward to hearing from the panel on this topic and how the industry can drive change in this important area. So I wanted to start with a quick recap on the methodology before we dig into the data. So 27 markets deployed an online survey during the summer, which yielded a phenomenal 10,000 responses, although we would love more next time. We asked some searching questions about how people identify across various protected characteristics, and also their experiences in the workplace. At the heart of the survey was what we call the Inclusion Index, which allows us to put each market's results into context and provide a platform for change via action. So if we can move on to the next slide and look at the sample breakdown, we can see we've got a slight skew towards women and a small proportion of respondents identifying as gender non-conforming. When we look at organisation type, we can see good representation from brands and agencies, and we also see a good mix of seniority and age groups. So this therefore gives us a great platform to dig into the data and look at how different demographics experience inclusion in the workplace. So on the next slide, I just want to talk to you a little bit more about what is the Inclusion Index. So it's a formula that looks to boil down everything relating to DEI into a one-number score, which can then be used to benchmark performance. And it is made up of 3 sub-indices and can be calculated via adding what we call sense of belonging and absence of discrimination indices and taking away the presence of negative behaviour index. These indices are derived from the responses to a series of statements relating to each area. So for example, sense of belonging is made up of the percentage agreeing with statements such as, I feel like I belong at my company, or I'm provided with sufficient support to develop my skills and progress my career. Presence of negative behaviour tracks instances of being unfairly spoken of over in meetings, being made to feel uncomfortable in the workplace, and other examples. And absence of discrimination looks at each of the protected characteristics of things like age, gender, sexual orientation, and the level of discrimination personally experienced in each market. Okay, so if we can move on to the next slide. With that backdrop, how is the ad industry and marketing industry performing globally? So against Kantar benchmarks, as we saw in the video, the answer is pretty well. But before we all start congratulating each other, I'd like to throw in a note of caution. So these benchmarks we're comparing to are from 2019, and the world has changed dramatically since then. So most obviously with the COVID pandemic, which has impacted all of us to some degree, but also with movements highlighting social injustice such as Black Lives Matter, really bring critical DEI issues into sharp focus. So what was good in 2019 might be different now as we move into 2022. But despite this positive score, as we will see when we dig deeper, there's still a lot of variation by market, and there are some universal issues that need to be addressed. We'll have new benchmarks available in early 22 to further put these results into context. And I'm now going to take you through some of the standout findings of the report. So the first one, to lead off, for me, one of the biggest findings is related to this risk of churn. So 1 in 7 respondents said they were likely to leave their organisation due to a lack of inclusion and diversity. And that rose to 1 in 4 in some markets. So what's very clear here, DEI is not a tick box or an optional pursuit. It is fundamental to sound business practice, and is fast becoming table stakes for employees if it isn't already. And if companies don't get this right, then people will vote with their feet. And against the backdrop of the great resignation, as it's being called, and the war for talent, this statistic shows us why it's critical to get DEI right. So if we move on to the next slide, what are the most common types of issues that people are experiencing that could be causing this? So perhaps not surprisingly, at a global level, the most common forms of discrimination were reported for family status. By that we mean childcare and other caregiving responsibilities, and age. Now these are universal issues which cut across geographies and cultures. And sadly, 40% of women say family status can hinder one's career, and over a third of all respondents believe age can hinder one's career. There's a real opportunity here for the industry globally to come up with a response to these worrying findings. On the next slides, we can then continue to look at gender, and we're able to calculate the index for women and men. And we can see that overall, we go from the average of 64 globally to an 8-point gap, which is driven by a lower sense of belonging and a higher experience of negative behaviors. And if we look at the next slides, then regrettably, we see that in many cases, this then manifests itself as a gender pay gap, particularly at senior levels. We're looking at here exec management, C-suite, and other senior staff. And basically anything above 0% is a pay gap in favor of men. So clearly some issues here to address. And whilst this improves at more junior levels, we're still seeing some clear issues in some markets that need to be addressed. And just to illustrate this point further, only 35% of respondents said their company provides equal work, pay for equal work. Okay, moving on, we see a similar picture for ethnic and national minorities, but this is a far more nuanced issue when we try and look at this globally. So for instance, in some markets, for example, the US, maybe South Africa, Brazil, we are comparing the experience of different ethnic groups, which typically fare poorly compared to their majority colleagues. But in other markets, for example, Hong Kong or Spain, we didn't ask about ethnicity, we asked about nationality. And in these cases, foreign nationals' experience is actually better than their local counterparts. So this is where local action planning is key, to take into account specific market issues and sensitivities. And then when looking at instances of negative behavior, we can also see that the most common forms of these are experienced more often by women and ethnic minorities. So this includes being unfairly spoken over in meetings and people taking sole credit for shared efforts. On the next slides, you can see we were also able to deep dive into the experience of the LGBTQ community in markets where we were able to ask about this. And as you can see, LGBTQ respondents score lower on the overall index by 5 points versus their heterosexual colleagues. They experience more negative behaviors at work and are more likely to report feeling anxious at work. And on the next slides, we can look at disability, which is another universal issue. There are clear indications of barriers to entry. So for example, only 7% of respondents self-identified as disabled. And the majority of these are potentially hidden as they are mental and cognitive issues. And general disclosure, with only 44% having made their employer aware. But encouragingly, once made aware, employers are generally supportive. So there's another opportunity here to remove the stigma of disclosure. We also asked everyone who responded around any health issues they're experiencing, even if these weren't technically defined as a disability. And perhaps not surprisingly, 33% of all respondents reported feeling stressed or anxious, further underlining the need to provide support to staff and to have open and frank conversations about the impact of stress on people's lives and how this can be mitigated. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. So whilst so far I've been talking about the overall global picture, it's clear that it is at the market level, there are very different experiences at play. For instance, if we look at sense of belonging by market, we can see a 23% gap between the highest and lowest scoring markets. And for me, this serves to further underline that while global actions and initiatives can help to a point, action must be taken on the ground to drive meaningful change. So on the next slide, we can see where is action currently being taken and importantly, recognized by employees. Again, we're seeing a wide variation here to the question around, do you believe your company is actively taking steps to be more diverse and inclusive, with North America really leading the charge? And there's likely to be opportunities here for cross-pollination of ideas where some markets are more advanced, and we'll hear from Sharon on the panel later from the UK, with hopefully then the effect of that bringing some of the laggards catching up, and quickly, because failure to do so will only lead to further churn. So before we hand over to the panel, I want to leave you with my 5 key takeouts from the data. So first off, anyone who says DEI is not important just needs to look at this stat. So with a risk of 1 in 7 leaving the industry due to a lack of I&D, this issue really needs taken seriously and addressed urgently. Secondly, while women are well represented in the sample, this does not always translate to the senior levels of organizations, suggesting barriers to progression, most likely linked to family responsibilities. Ethnic minorities are generally underrepresented across the board, but most acutely in senior positions. And this is then resulting in a low sense of belonging for those minorities, as they don't have enough role models to aspire to. Mental health is clearly a big issue affecting many people, but the data suggests we're still uncomfortable talking about it. And for something that can go unseen, new strategies must be put in place to remove the taboo in this area. And finally, something our launch report shines a light on. It may sound obvious, but none of us are just one thing. We are made up of multiple characteristics that makes us our unique selves. So we need to ensure that we apply this intersectionality lens to all of our D&I actions to achieve maximum engagement, for our employees to feel heard, and to create an industry that not only attracts diverse talent, but nurtures that talent in an equitable and inclusive way. So of course, all of this and more, as Will said, is available now in our report to download. And I'd just like to thank you all for your time. And I'm now going to hand over to the WFA Global Diversity Ambassador, Belinda, and our expert panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gareth. Thank you, Will. Thank you to the WFA. It is really wonderful to be here. I am Belinda Smith, CEO of the Americas for M6, and I am very, very excited to host a lovely power panel of ladies. We have Emily Graham, the Chief Equity and Impact Officer at Omnicom. Sharon Lloyd Barnes, who is the Diversity Lead Advertising Association, and then Putri Realita, I practiced that beforehand, Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Danone. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. That was a whirlwind of a tour, I think, through the insights of which there are many, many, many. And I think for me, there are the overall theme of this research is kind of the devil's in the details, which is when we embarked on this work, almost a year ago, or maybe a little more than a year ago, I certainly had my preconceived notions for what we would find within the data. And as we have combed through the responses and the results of this survey, it's just, every nuance you unwrap around level of respondents, around ethnic minorities versus nationality reveals something quite different. And I think we see the full complexity of DEI issues come to light through this data. Putri, I'd really like to start with you because this is a global piece of research. And again, shows how complicated it is and how I think really we have to resist rolling things into a global average and clicking in and thinking about specific examples to have the most impact. Let's take Malaysia as an example, a market where business is run by minorities, and the Malay majority actually report having worse lived experiences. How does a global organization like Danone create a framework or think about addressing an issue as rich as this across so many countries?
Yes, thank you, Belinda, for the question. And first of all, I would like to say really thank you so much for WFA who really hold this survey. And I think this is really a great job, and to give all of us the first insights of how it looks like globally within this industry. And so well done for for all WFA team who's behind this. So just to answer your question, yes, I think that DEI is really a topic that we cannot say that one size fits all. So there is no one size fits all to address this topic. And I think that for consumers goods and more food and beverage company like Danone, it also links to how our consumers are choosing our products. So for example, like yogurt, maybe people consume yogurt also in a different way in a different country. So we really have to take into account the localities of all these topics. So I'll give you an example, and also DEI topics is really depending on the society where we live, and the society also depends on how infrastructure is built and how history is built in the society. And I think it's really something that we need to take into account the localities when we address this topic. And I'll give you an example. When we are implementing a global gender neutral parental policy globally for in the past 3 years, I mean it is 18 weeks parental leave, and of course maybe for people in Europe it's something that is already there, right? But if we talk about, I'm also coming from Indonesia myself. If we talk about countries in Asia, also in Africa, we know that 18 weeks means a lot. So that therefore, and I would like to also give an example on the ethnicity topic. And I think that we know that based on the results, there is also like the complexity about expatriates living in countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, where I think in terms of DEI, those in those countries, we need to also look at how local talents are being developed and being raised into the senior positions in the senior co-deal, like we call it, the leadership teams. So I think at Danone, we have really the principle that we want first to include everyone, and second, to enhance diversity wherever we operate. And we are combining this framework is a global roadmap, and we also have local roadmaps where we want to make sure that wherever we operate, we want to mimic the local communities. So for example, in the US, if we have, I don't know, 40% people of color, that means at Danone, we want to be as close as to that numbers as well. So, and also it's the same, it's how we translate that into different communities, local communities, wherever we operate. So I think this global roadmaps is important. Like for example, gender balance, we can have a global targets. But in terms of ethnicity, we need to look really at the local level, and this is where the local teams are playing parts on that. So we do have a combination of global roadmaps, local roadmaps, and even we have functional roadmaps. And functional roadmaps is based on the job functions like sales, operations, IT, because those are different functions, have different specificities that we want to push. So so I think that it is a complex topics, but it is challenging. But I think we really need to, that's why the inclusion part is so important. And the way we address this topic also needs to be inclusive, because then we need to listen to our local teams, and we need also to really understand how the local society and what is important in each local society and how Danone can make a difference.
So thank you for that. Just because we rarely get people of such caliber in these panels, Putri, I want to follow up with you with a really tactical question, because I acknowledge that this topic can feel overwhelming for people who are new to it and seeking to make an impact. In your organization, do you have one of you in each local market, and you guys come together to ladder up globally? Are you overall responsible for the discipline and it's on you to interface with local business leaders? Just tell us a little bit more about functionally how an organization that large might bring this to life globally.
Sure, yes. I think the governance is really key to really make things happen on the ground. And we put in place governance. So at the global level, so I'm leading this topic globally under HR, but also we have a global council, we call it. So this global council, we have a COMEX executive committee sponsors. So they are people who are running the business. So like the chief growth officer and also the chief operating officer. Those are our executive committee sponsors. And we have every function, global function like sales, operations, IT, etc. They have one or two people appointed by their functional board to sit also in this council, to be contributing to, okay, they need to have the functional roadmap that I mentioned before. What is needed to drive this topic within that particular function. And then at the local level we have some people like me. They are also part of HR. We call it the DEI leaders. And they also, in some markets, they also have similar governance like in the global level. So they have the GM sponsors at the local level, and also the different champions on the ground, different functions. And we also put also brands. So not only the people part, but also the chief marketing officer. It's so important because we are consumer FMCG company, and our brands have really the power to create change also in the society. So that's why marketing also needs to be on the table. And then the third one is partners, so like a chief partner officer. So they are the one who look at partnership, how we can partner with external organizations such as WFA, for example, to drive changes in the society. So there are this functional versus local organizations that are combining this people, brands, and partners approach.
Wonderful. Thank you for that insight. I think it's really fascinating that there is, the function that's embedded with HR, but then you're able to use that council to bring in so many other critical parts of the business and understanding that it can't just be an HR initiative.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. Emily, I am really intrigued by your title, which has impact in it. And I think another thing we see from the survey, at least one thing that stands out to me, is we have such a high number of people who on the one hand believe their companies are taking action to address DE&I, but we also have an equally high number of people who are considering leaving the industry overall because the impact is not there. And so I think, it is important to talk about impact. One of the things that rose to the top in this survey is gender experiences. The punishment for being a female caretaker, not only gender pay gaps at more junior levels, but even in my seat in CEO positions in the C-suite, still experiencing double-digit pay gaps. And so I wonder, how when you think about the work that you do, how do you focus on impact? Like, how would you think that we can get past just knowing a problem exists to actually being able to move the needle to get different results over time?
Well, thank you for having me, and I am really excited to get into this conversation today. I will say that the decision to put impact into my title was purposeful. When I came to Omnicom in January of 2021, I really had some carte blanche to reimagine what the traditional chief diversity officer role had been at our company for the prior 11 plus years. And it was time for innovation. It was time for transformation, and impact is a constant reminder that we all are here to do some incredible work. And if we keep impact in my title, it makes me accountable, and it makes everyone who works with me accountable. So that was a decisive choice, and I'm glad that's resonant. And it's just not for title, it's for actual action. So, one of the things I think makes people want to act is when they feel personally affected by what's going on. The problem with diversity, equity, inclusion is it can feel like you're doing something for that group. You can other very easily if it does not feel personal to you. And I may not be a caretaker, but I need to be able to understand, empathize with, and respect what caretakers might deal with and what may make them feel or actually experience displacement in their careers that makes them feel stagnated. And if you're not able to understand that, then how can I advocate for them? How can I act for them? How can I make impactful decisions for them? Well, I can't. And so part of the work at Omnicom, and that I think all of our D&I practitioners must do, is to really dismantle the othering that happens so that we can take a report like this, find ourselves in it, find our colleagues in it, find our aspiring leaders in it, and begin to work and make impact that matters to them. Because I do find sometimes that when you do other, you think you're making an impactful strategy, impactful statement, impactful action, and it means nothing to the community that you're trying to make a difference for. So I think the other thing we must do is have their voices be heard. If caretakers are saying, and women are saying, I feel disproportionately disadvantaged because of my gender, because of my career journey, we need to help them. They need to tell us more. Share with me, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Make it tactile for me, because I think therein lies some of the issue and the friction in corporates with implementing DE&I. It's so top down. It is so top down, but there has to be bottom up. It has to be grassroots. Therein lies what we are trying to do. And so impact matters in many ways, and it sounds nice, but truthfully, when you do make an impact, you change people's lives. You change how they belong. You change how they show up. You change how they contribute, which is why that's so important to me.
Wow, very well said. I have been wrestling with the concept of othering, and I haven't had the language for it before now. You just said that so wonderfully, which is one bone to pick that I always have with diversity is we make it feel like a charitable exercise where we're doing something for someone else. And so I really love the way that you've just summarized that. I think that's a wonderful way to think about that. Sharon, what Emily did touch on was that we are ripe for innovation and disruption. And again, thinking about the impact. And I know that you have been heads down in data much longer than we have. We are very eager, honored, and excited to follow on from the work that you've done in helping and make this survey global. And, you know, would just ask from you, what kind of local nuances were you able to see in the UK data? And since you're a little further down the path from a time perspective than we are, anything you could share about how you all are thinking about designing actions that have impact so that the next time we run the survey, the numbers are different, I think would be really fascinating to hear about.
Thanks, Belinda. It's really great to meet everybody on the panel. So funnily enough, action was the sort of foundational piece of this campaign for us. We knew that we recognized about a year ago there was a lot of frustration in our market in the UK around what was perceived as little progress in some areas of inclusion and diversity, despite the fact there's a huge amount of investment, whether it's resources or money. There's fantastic initiatives going on across the industry, some for many years. So we were kind of looking at that, thinking how can we help as the trade body that represents the UK advertising industry, and by collaborating with the IPA and ISPA, who represent advertisers and agencies, we came up with this idea of an action plan, which is really pulling together all the work that's happening and joining the dots. We thought there'd be some power in that, and that's where the All-In Census was born, and what's now become this global work was really to evidence that action plan, because we knew we couldn't just say, do this, like where to start. It's such a complex area. And I think that's probably at the root of why there has been little progress in some of the areas, just because people don't know where to start. And when they do, they might get distracted by something else that's a more pressing issue within their organisation. So yeah, action plan was there from the start. We launched the survey, which we called the All-In Census, to make it sound a bit more important than it was. We knew there was survey fatigue. We knew we needed to get people's attention. So we called it the All-In Census. We created a bit of a movement. I think we had about 6 weeks at the beginning of this year to engage with industry leaders across, advertisers, media and creative agencies, the media, tech platforms, production companies, and ask those leaders to support the census on the day. So pretty much 80% of the 16,000 people that took part did it on March the 10th. And I think that just shows us that, you know, that frustration sort of reached fever pitch in the UK. And I think the pandemic was our biggest friend in a way. It allowed us to use that energy and that really positive intention to sort of translate it into what has now become an action plan. So we got the evidence. You know, there's a great saying, isn't there? What matters gets measured. And I think we've now got this incredibly rich set of data that we've now got globally, which is so exciting. And ours very much mirrors a lot of what's seen globally. That was number one kind of observation for me. There's some nuances that are different in the UK. I mean, again, we had slightly more representation from women in the respondents, sort of over 16,000. In fact, almost exactly the same split, sort of 59-41, and very similar experience. So the gender pay gap, great representation, but that switches sort of middle management up, so there's less representation in C-suite. That impacts the gender pay gap. And about 53% of women say that parenting or caregiving has impacted their career negatively. So it really mirrors what we've seen globally. Some interesting, you know, slight nuances were that LGBTQ+, we overrepresent by about 3 times the UK working population for people, you know, across different sexual orientations, which is really interesting, and they have a relatively positive experience. But when you lay over the mental health issues and the disabilities that we see at quite high levels across the world, that they're disproportionately affected by those. So I guess going back to the action plan, how we engage, because we already have the leaders and now the individuals who work in advertising leaning into this work, it was pretty easy to then kind of use the data, because the data is telling us what to do. So it doesn't now become something that we're saying everyone should do. This is, our voices have been heard. And we again, to try and simplify, and I mean, if I'm going to put it really crudely, just not allow anyone anywhere to hide, we came up with just 3 actions in the first phase of the action plan. So we've been sitting, when we launched the findings, a bit like we are today for the global data, we did it, very similar event, but we announced the action plan the same day. And it has just 3 actions, and then we're announcing another 3 in January. And they're basically the top line data. It's to improve the representation and experience of Black talent in the UK, to improve the experience and representation of disabled talent, and improve the representation and experience of people from working class backgrounds, because we still have our class system in the UK. And actually what that's rooted in more, the latter one, is the fact that we have an over-reliance on university graduates in advertising in the UK. So about 72% of people that work in advertising have a degree and went to university, against 48% of our working population. So that it also just sort of balance that and have more diversity of thought, more diverse backgrounds, and that's different ethnicities, different parts of the country. We're really focusing on that. And what's really great about it is, you know, there's been no challenge about it not being ambitious enough. I think people recognise by simplifying it and making it so focused, it enables an organisation, wherever they are in their journey, to be able to take part in it. There's nothing patronising about saying we want to improve the experience, because the data is telling us that 1/3 of Black talent in the UK think they'll leave the industry. So no one can hide from that data. And even if you're in a fantastic agency or a fantastic media owner who's doing great work in that area and has made progress, you can lay over this framework that we've introduced to support people to the work that you're already doing, and just kind of fly through it, I guess. Just go, okay, we're doing that already. It highlights any gaps that you might have missed, and it just puts you in a position where you're ready for the next round of actions. So that's kind of where we're at. And it's probably important to say that the actions that we have proposed to help the experience of people in the industry is they're all based on work that's already being done. So we approached every pressure group across the industry, whether they tackle ethnic representation, women, age, because ageism is obviously an issue probably globally. I think we've seen LGBTQ+ communities. We've approached all of them and said we've gifted them the data essentially for their group, and said, please, can you help us we want to amplify the work you're already doing. So that's kind of fed into our action plan. I think that's really important because again, it accelerates change if we're tapping into the brilliant foundations that are already there.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I also like that for each of the 3 pieces of the current action plan, you're recognizing representation, but also experience. And I think that for me personally has been a frustrating journey over my professional career.
I think, yeah, I mean, that's.
Oh, you go.
Yeah, no, sorry, it broke up there. I think that was probably my end. Terrible Wi-Fi in the UK. No, just to echo that. I mean, I think I didn't flag that. That was the biggest, almost the biggest surprise, I suppose, of the data overall, is that it's the experience that we need to improve. And Gareth touched on it earlier on the global results. But it's before we focus on investing more in recruiting talent into the industry, I think there's a piece about getting our house in order and really improving the experience for everybody. And that goes back to what Emily was saying. Inclusion is something that everyone benefits from. You know, we're all intersectional in different ways. And so if we can improve everybody's experience, you know, which I think the mental health things we've seen that in the last year, that does very much impact everybody, then it's just a good thing. So that's our priority, is to improve that. So when we do the census again in 2 years, we want to bring those numbers down and hopefully representation up. But I think that's a slightly longer term goal for us at the moment.
Yeah, Putri, I would love to hear if you all internally as a brand have either made a switch from recruiting to inclusion or just widened your focus area to include experiences the employees are having once they're there, and like what are some ways that you are centering that or focusing on that? Because again, I think our recruiting muscle tends to be a little stronger because that's where we have focused for so long, but adding in lived experience and inclusion and belonging is a little bit newer, and I would love to hear, you know, how you all are approaching that.
Yeah. I fully agree with Sharon about the inclusion part, because in Danone we even call it ID. So we call it it's inclusive diversity. So the I comes first before the D, and I think that it's so important, because if we only recruit diverse people and they just come to the company and they sit there in the meeting and they are not being listened to, or they feel like they are not being retained in the company, then what's the point, right? So the inclusion part is the part where it makes diversity really brings advantage to the business. And so, for example, in Danone, inclusive leadership is being part of our key leadership competencies, and this not only including how we recruit people, but how we bring different voices in the room. So how to listen to the silent in the room. So everybody needs to have a voice, and we train our leaders on this topic, also about changing from unconscious bias to conscious inclusion, and also working on debiasing our HR processes, and especially when we develop or promote people, and you know, we have this talent review process where we assess talents in a meeting, and all the team leaders are there, and we put in place, we call it a guardian angel, ID guardian angel. So this guardian angel's role is really to challenge any biased comments that are being said in the meeting. So for example, if we are assessing women talent and people are talking about mobility, but she's not mobile, how can we, you know, develop her to promote her in the next level, and then this guardian angel will say, well, we talk about men talent before, we didn't talk about mobility at all, so why suddenly we talk about mobility? So so this really put in place a different kind of conversations in terms of talent, and I think this is like a step to start to debiasing those kind of processes, and also some example also how we also make sure that, because in Danone, for example, most of our employees are in the factories. They are working in the factories, and how can we make it relevant for them as well? And we know that in the factories, there are very women are minority, especially in the shop floors, and we try to create the factories which are friendly for women. For example, in Mexico, we have this pink line. So the line, we really build the line, we recruit the women and we train them, and we also modified the line to make sure that it's ergonomically possible for women to operate it. And actually, we also measure how productivity have increased since this line has been operating, and that also helps to basically improve our gender balance representations also in the factories. So and also we implement also we call it ID contact. So ID contact is like 10 minutes contact talking about ID, inclusive diversity in every meeting. So we have our champions on the ground. We have more than 300 people. They are the ones who promote this in their teams. So people are starting to put things on the table. How can we make our team more inclusive? Like sharing some issues that they felt in the team, and start to resolve that within the team. So I think real inclusion really happens on the ground in the team experience, where you go to the office every day and you are welcomed by your team members, and you are interacting with your team, and you are in meeting, and you feel like you are making a difference. You feel like your voice is being heard, and you feel like you are belonging to the team. So I think that's the most important part of DEI.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you. Just a quick reminder and tip, if you have questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen there. I think there are also some questions in the chat, which Will from WFA are responding to in real time. But please, if you have questions, now is the time to ask them. Putri, I love hearing tales from Danone, because it seems that you have such a large and efficient system of really kind of deputizing people on the ground or in different teams or in different territories to care deeply about the issue and bring that to life in their perspective places. Emily, I want to come back to something that you said earlier around really having empathy for an experience that may not be your lived experience, and that being the best way that you can imagine how to improve that experience on behalf of someone. I would love to hear more about what that process has been like for you over the last year, whether that is how you are choosing what on the long list to solve today, or whether that is running into feedback that you yourself aren't super familiar with, and how you might approach, just structuring out what needs to be done and then doing it in a way that really does have impact.
Sure. I was looking at Oliver's question in the chat, and this is similar to it. I grapple with it because diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a feel-good exercise. It's not a problem to solve. I don't see it that way. I know some people do. I think it's an opportunity. I think it's a right. I think it is a reality. I think it is so many more things, and it's certainly not charitable, and it's certainly not a woe is me exercise. I do think, though, it is intensely personal, and I think it requires a lot of responsibility. I don't feel like I'm shouldering the responsibility of others to do better. I think they have to do that. And I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is as impactful as individuals believe in it and believe that they must be a part of making a workplace more equitable, being more inclusive in the choices they make, surrounding themselves with a more diverse community. I think there are people who would never have a reason to interface with some of the audiences that are outlined in the report, and I understand that. And I think the best way to go about it is to make this report personal, talk to somebody, ask them some open-ended questions, and really be prepared to listen without defense to what their experiences are. And then you might have a better realm of what you can do in your realm of influence to make it more impactful. I've found that's the shortest way to get people to act. They don't want to be beat over the head. They don't want to be guilt tripped. And frankly, people in marginalized communities don't want you to feel bad for them. They don't want you to look at them and be sad. They want you to look at them and see equality. They want you to look at them and see an empowered and meaningful and deserving person just like you. So I think that we have to find ways to deconstruct the power dynamics that play into those in positions of influence of power, or a majority feeling bad for a minority, because that just underscores more of what we don't need. I think that leaders have to be very intentional about spreading the responsibility. I think that it is not the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer or the D&I officer's only role. The CEO, the CFO, the COO, all of those in the C-suite, every middle line and junior level person has a stake in this. They are all different. They all have the ability to do something different, but it should not just be to one group of people, one role in a company. That's not how change and impact begins to take shape. It begins to take shape when there's a collective shared responsibility, but when each person knows exactly what they do. And when people start to see their work be recognized and the outputs of the things they've done, the decisions they've made, the small actions they've taken, the biases they've checked, they are proud. They are really proud, and they don't want to be a part of the problem. They want to be a part of the solution. And I think that's also another incentive for people who are wondering where to start. Make people feel part of the solution. And that's going to get them to be more vested in the outcomes and the positive changes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Very well said. Now that I've plugged the chat, and Emily, you've answered our first question from the chat, going in, I see something that I'm actually curious to throw to Sharon, which is around one of the big things that came out of this report was that there's still different experiences within the industry based on age. And I think that's something that as an industry, we touch on every now and then about our obsession with youth in this industry and ageism. And I guess I wonder, is that something that you also saw pop in your survey? Is that something that you all have designed things around in the past, or overall, you know, your experiences or your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think actually it lays over lots of the other groups and lots of the other identifying factors. Ageism for us in the UK is a problem at both ends of the spectrum. And I think, again, I mentioned that over-reliance on graduates. So we really underrepresent under 22, 23 with, you know, kids come straight out of school. And then we significantly drop off. I think we're half the UK working population at sort of 44 plus, and it just gets lower and lower. But I think there's loads of factors around that. I think disability is a big part of it. As we age, what we wouldn't necessarily define as disability are things like, you know, our sight, our hearing, mobility being impacted, just as normal aging process. I think that impacts people wanting to work in a very fast-paced, very stressful environment. I think the very high stats around mental health and linked with stress have impacted that as well. And I think we talked about the parental and caregiving responsibilities. If it's difficult to be a parent and go back to working in the environments that we have, that's going to impact the ageism part. So I don't think it's as simple as just people getting to 40 and saying, okay, you're done, find another career. But we have got, early next year, we will be launching a specific action to tackle ageism. I can't reveal it on the call today, but it's looking more creatively at how we can utilise particularly the older members of our workforce and really value that wisdom, that insight, that experience in a way that we possibly don't in every organisation now.
Wonderful, thank you. I love that you have also left us at a little bit of a teaser or a cliffhanger for more coming soon on the topic. Listen, I have probably not managed time super well because I've been really involved in this discussion, and thank you to the audience for your participation. I know we have some unanswered Q&A questions, but we will do this again. We will have many more conversations, definitely leading up to repeating this research, please, 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 all of you, the report is available for download now. Please download that report and share it as widely as possible. We will be back in 2022 to talk much more about all of these themes, to talk about action plan, and a huge thank you to our wonderful panelists today. And personally from me, just the biggest thank you to the WFA. This has been a Herculean effort beyond measure. I never want to talk to this many lawyers ever again, but it's been sorely needed, and I'm super proud of everything that has been accomplished. Thank all of you for your time today. Please go download the report, and remember to design your workplaces for inclusion and for belonging and for lived experience. Thank you so much. We'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.